the weakest calf in the auction pen, had a yellow tag on her ear, and both knees shaking in the sawdust. Nobody raised a hand. Not the cattlemen by the gate, not the feed store regulars, not even the buyers waiting for something cheap. The auctioneer dropped the price to $25, and still the room stayed quiet. Then Walter Hayes, a 71-year-old veteran farmer in a faded field jacket, noticed one thing the others missed. The little calf was still trying to reach the water trough. When he raised his hand, the men by the coffee pot laughed. Before we begin, tell us where you re-watching from tonight. Because months later, that same shaking calf would walk into the county fair ring, and the man who laughed first would take off his cap. Before he could find the words, Walter Hayes first saw the shaking calf at the far end of the auction pen, where the weak ones usually ended up. Not near the gate, where the healthier calves pushed forward and bawled loud enough to make themselves known. Not in the center, where buyers leaned over the rails and studied backs, hips, legs, and weight. She stood in the back corner beside a bent panel, with sawdust stuck to her damp knees, and a yellow tag swinging from one ear. Every time her head trembled. Lot 19B. That was all the auction sheet called her. Not Angus. Not Hereford. Not crossbred. Just small brown heifer. Light condition. In auction language, that meant trouble. She was too small for the group she had come in with. Her coat was dull brown, with a pale streak along the neck. Her ribs did not show sharply, but Walter could see enough to know she had missed more than one good feeding. Her legs looked too long for the rest of her body, like she had not yet figured out how to carry herself. When she shifted her weight, both front knees shook. A man by the coffee pot gave a short laugh. That calf won't live long enough to eat breakfast, Cal Morgan said. The men near him laughed, because it sounded practical enough to be true. Walter Hayes stood, with one hand resting on the top rail. He was 71 years old, though most people in Graves County still called him the veteran, more often than they called him old. He wore a faded field jacket, with the cuffs worn thin, a gray cap pulled low, and boots that had been resoled twice, because the uppers were still good. Walter did not throw away useful things, and he did not call something useless before he had looked at it properly. He had not come to the auction looking for trouble. He had come for a calf that made sense. Something steady. Something close to weaned. Something with clear eyes, sound legs, and enough frame to grow on summer grass. If the rain did its part, and the creek pasture held. He had $63 folded in his inside coat pocket, and another $20 in the truck ashtray, though he did not count that, unless something broke on the way home. Feed was high. Diesel was higher. The south fence still needed 2 posts, and the barn roof had a seam that tapped in hard rain, like it was reminding him of a promise. A man alone on a small farm learned to plan before he spent. That morning, Walter had opened his black composition notebook at the kitchen table. The spine was held together with duct tape. The back cover had a coffee stain, shaped like the bottom of his old mug. He wrote the date, then the weather. Cold morning. Frost on trough. North wind. Below that, he wrote, need 1 calf. Sound legs. Clear eyes. No cough. No foolish bidding. He underlined the last 3 words. No foolish bidding. Walter believed in kindness, but he did not confuse kindness with bad judgment. A farm could forgive a soft heart now and then. It could not forgive a person who stopped doing the math. He had walked the pen slowly for almost an hour. The black calves near the south rail looked good, but the bidding would go too high. 2 red heifers had clean coats and strong backs, but one coughed twice, and Walter moved on. A brindle steer caught his eye, until he saw swelling above one hock. Then he came back to lot 19B. Maybe it was the way she stayed on her feet. Maybe it was the way she kept turning her head toward the water trough, even after another calf pushed in front of her. Maybe it was because every person who looked at her had already made a decision, and Walter had lived long enough to mistrust fast decisions. He stepped closer. The calf's eyes were not dull. That mattered. Her breathing was not rattled. That mattered too. Her nose was damp. Her ears moved when the auction gate clanged. When a larger calf bumped her shoulder, she staggered, but she did not fold. She planted both shaking knees, lowered her head, and tried again to reach the trough. The water was only a few feet away. For a healthy calf, that was nothing. For this one, it looked like a road. She took one step, stopped. Her knees trembled hard enough that a boy near the rail laughed under his breath. She took another step. A bigger calf swung its head and crowded her away from the trough. The shaking calf backed up, not from fear exactly, but from not having enough strength to argue. She stood there a moment, with her head low, sides moving, yellow tag swinging. Then she tried again. Walter's fingers tightened around the rail. Ruth had been gone 5 years, but Walter still remembered what she said over a runt lamb during an ice storm. The vet had said it probably would not last the night. Ruth wrapped it in warm towels, fed it with a medicine dropper, and sat beside the stove until morning. When Walter told her she was spending too much effort on a lamb that might not live, Ruth looked at him over the top of her glasses. Weak isn't the same as finished, she said. The lamb lived. Not because Ruth wished it alive. Because she checked, warmed, fed, watched, adjusted, and refused to call a thing done before it was. Walter looked at lot 19B again. Weak wasn't the same as finished. A man in a brown vest came down the aisle with a clipboard. Walter knew him by sight. His name was Darrell, and he worked the back pens when the auction was busy. "What's the story on that little brown heifer?" Walter asked. Darrell looked toward the corner. "That one?" Walter nodded. Darrell shrugged. "Came in with a mixed lot from over near Graves County. Man said she was the bottom calf. Been pushed around some. She's sick." "Not that I know." "Scours. Didn't to see any." "Fever." Darrell shifted the clipboard under his arm. "I didn't check her with a thermometer." "Mr. Hayes." Walter looked at him. Darrell sighed. "She is poor. That's what she is. Poor and shook up. Might come around. Might not." That was at least an honest answer. "What are they asking?" Darrell gave him a look that said the price would not be the problem. Whatever the room decides she is worth. Walter almost smiled. Rooms were not always good at deciding worth. The sale moved on. The good calves came first. Buyers leaned forward. Hands lifted. Numbers climbed. The auctioneer's voice rolled over the barn, in that fast river of sound that made money feel less like money, until the gavel came down, and a man had to live with what he had spent. Walter let them pass. The black calves went too high. The red heifers went higher. A clean-framed steer sold, for more than Walter had in both pockets, and probably the ashtray too. He waited. Every few minutes, he looked back at Lot 19B. She was still standing. Not proudly, not strongly, but standing. That counted for something, if a person knew how to count it. Near the coffee pot, Cal Morgan was still talking. Cal owned more pasture than Walter had ever walked in one morning, and had a way of making every opinion sound like county policy. Hayes is studying that little wobbler, Cal said. Someone chuckled. Maybe he's looking for a pet. Another man said. Walter did not turn around. He had learned years ago that not every shot fired in your direction deserved the dignity of being answered. At the front of the barn, the auctioneer finished with a pen of feeder calves, and glanced down at the next sheet. His voice changed when he saw the number. Not cruel, not kind, just practical. We've got Lot 19B. He called. Small brown heifer calf. Little light. Little shaky. Anybody want to start her at 50? No hands went up. 40 then, the auctioneer said. Nothing. Cal Morgan laughed into his coffee. 30? Still nothing. The auctioneer looked around the room, already half ready to move on. $25, he said. Somebody take her home. A few heads turned. Not toward the calf. Toward Walter. That was how laughter started in a small county. Not with a roar. With a glance shared between people who believed the answer was obvious. Walter felt the folded bills inside his coat pocket. He had written no foolish bidding. He had meant it. A shaking calf could become a dead calf. A weak animal could take milk. Bedding, medicine, hours of sleep, and still leave a man with an empty stall, and a lesson he already knew. But then the calf lifted her head. The water trough sat across the pen. She looked at it, took one trembling step, stopped, took another. Her knees shook. Her ear tag swung, but she did not lie down. Walter raised his hand. The auctioneer saw him and paused just long enough for the whole barn to notice. 25 from Mr. Hayes, he said. The gavel had not even come down yet. But behind Walter, near the coffee pot, Cal Morgan started laughing. The gavel came down, like a small piece of wood, closing a large opinion. Sold. $25 to Mr. Hayes. For half a second, nobody said anything. Then the auction barn remembered how to laugh. It started by the coffee pot, where Cal Morgan stood, with one boot hooked over the bottom rail, and a paper cup in his hand. Then it moved to the men along the gate, then to the two boys sitting on an overturned feed bucket, near the office door. Walter Hayes did not look back. He took the sales slip from the clerk, folded it once, and put it in the same coat pocket as his notebook. Lot 19B stood in the holding pen, with her head low, knees still trembling, yellow tag flicking, when she shook off a fly that was not there. Cal raised his voice. Just enough. Walter, you buying calves now, or collecting charity cases? A few men laughed again. Walter opened the gate latch. Darrell, the pen hand, came over with a short lead rope. She may not load easy, Darrell said. Walter looked at the calf, then at the narrow alley that led toward the trailers. She's been pushed enough for one morning, he said. We'll give her a minute. That quieted Darrell, if not the room. Walter did not pull hard. He did not slap the rope against his leg, or click his tongue, like a man trying to prove something. He stood beside the calf, one hand low on the rope, and waited until she took her first uncertain step. It was not pretty. Her front legs shook. Her back end drifted sideways. Twice, she stopped and lowered her head, as if the barn floor had become too much to think about. From behind him, Cal called, "Better carry her, Hayes. Might be faster." Walter kept walking. The calf made it to the trailer ramp. In 6 minutes. A healthy calf would have done it. In 20 seconds. Everyone watching knew that. Walter knew it too. But he also knew something else. She had walked it. All of it. No dragging. No collapse. No quitting. At the trailer, she paused with one front hoof on the wood. Walter rested his hand against her neck. Her coat was rough under his palm, thin over the bone, but warm. Still warm. Easy, he said. The calf leaned forward, then stepped up. When the trailer door closed behind her, Cal shook his head. $25, he said, and that S before the feed bill. Then he took a sip of coffee and added, "Some calves are born finished." Walter climbed into his old blue pickup and started the engine. The truck had a cracked dashboard, a gun rack with no gun in it, and a thermos on the passenger floor that had rolled against an old fence staple. The heater worked when it felt like it. That morning, it blew air that was almost warm and smelled faintly of dust. Walter did not drive home first. He drove to Ramsey Feed Farm Supply. By the time he parked beside the loading dock, the story had beaten him there. That was how stories traveled in Graves County. They moved through men standing beside trailers, women at the diner register, a cousin who had seen something from the road, and a feed clerk who had heard half of it and supplied the rest. Phil Ramsey was behind the counter, writing numbers on a yellow invoice pad. He had run the store for 26 years and had learned not to look surprised until he knew the whole shape of a thing. He glanced up when Walter came in. "Morning, Walter." "Phil." There were 3 other people in the store. Mrs. Harlan from the East Ridge was buying mineral blocks. A younger man in a seed company cap was looking at fence insulators. Near the coffee machine, Gary Tuttle stood with one hand around a foam cup and the other in his jacket pocket. Gary turned when the bell over the door quit ringing. "Heard you bought the shaking calf," he said. Walter took off his gloves and set them on the counter. "That S right." Gary smiled, not cruelly, but with the comfort of a man who believed the story had already explained itself. Cal said she wanted to make breakfast. Walter looked at the shelves behind Phil. Then I better buy something. She can eat before supper. Phil's pencil stopped moving. Mrs. Harlan looked down at her mineral block and hid a small smile. Walter walked the aisles slowly. He picked up a bag of milk replacer, 1 sack of calf starter, 2 packets of electrolyte mix, a small bottle with a nipple, and a thermometer sealed in plastic. From the back corner, he added a folded calf blanket, navy blue, with a strap that looked stronger than the blanket. Phil rang it up, without commentary. The total was more than Walter liked. He counted bills from his pocket and set them on the counter, one by one. The 20 from the truck ashtray stayed where it was. He would not use it, unless something broke. A calf was not something broken. Not yet. Phil put the receipt in the bag. You see something in her? The store became quieter than it had been a moment before. Walter picked up the bag of electrolyte mix and turned it once in his hand. She was still trying to reach water. He said. Gary gave a short laugh through his nose. That all? Walter put the packet back in the paper sack. That S, more than nothing. Nobody had an easy answer for that. He carried the supplies out through the loading dock. Phil followed with the calf starter and set it in the bed of the truck, beside a coil of old rope and a dented mineral tub. At the trailer slats, the calf stood with her head low. Her knees still shook, but she was upright. Phil looked at her for a long moment. She got a name? No. Planning to give her one? Walter looked through the slats at the yellow tag. Not today. Phil understood that. A man did not name every hope. On the first day, Walter drove home on County Road 6, slower than usual. The trailer rattled over the patched places in the pavement. Past the church sign, past the closed produce stand, with pumpkins still sitting out front, softening in the cold. Past Col Morgan South pasture, where black cattle stood thick and healthy, near the hay ring. Cal was at the gate when Walter passed. Of course he was. He lifted one hand, not quite a wave, not quite a joke. Walter lifted 2 fingers from the steering wheel and kept going. By noon, the story had reached the Mayfield Creek Diner. By 1, it was at the post office. By 2, 2 men at the hardware store were saying Walter Hayes had bought a calf that could barely breathe. By 3, someone had changed $25 into $50. By 4, someone said he had bought her because he was lonely. By supper, a man at the diner was saying Walter had carried the calf into the trailer himself, though he had not been at the auction, and had never seen the trailer. That was how a story grew, when people watered it with certainty. Walter would have disliked the lonely part most, if anyone had been foolish enough to say it to his face. He was lonely. That did not make him confused. Back at the farm, he backed the trailer up to the small barn, instead of the main lot. The small barn had held bottle calves years ago, back when Ruth was alive, and the farm had more noise in it. Walter had cleaned it in the fall, but had not planned to use it until spring. Plans changed. He spread fresh straw in the corner stall thick enough to hold warmth, but not so deep. A weak calf would struggle to find her feet. He hung a water bucket low. He filled a shallow pan with a handful of calf starter, more for smell than eating. He mixed electrolyte in warm water and checked it against the inside of his wrist, the way Ruth used to do. Then he opened the trailer. The calf did not come out. Walter waited. The afternoon light slanted through the barn boards in thin yellow lines. Dust moved in those lines. Somewhere beyond the barn, a crow called from the fence post, near the creek pasture. The calf blinked at him through the trailer gloom. "Easy," Walter said. It took 11 minutes to get her down the ramp. He did not pull, except to guide. Twice she stopped. Once she lowered herself halfway, and Walter thought she might fold right there. But she caught herself, shook hard through both front legs, and stepped down. Into the barn. Into the straw. Into the first place all day, where nobody was laughing. Walter closed the stall gate behind her. She stood in the corner, with her head low and sides moving. Up close, she looked smaller than she had at the auction. The barn made that plain. The hollow ahead of her hip. The mud dried along her lower legs. The rough patch where another calf had rubbed hair from her shoulder. Walter wrote in the notebook, Lot 19B, brown heifer, light condition, shaking, eyes clear, nose damp, loaded under own power, stalled in South Barn. He paused. Then he added, not finished. He warmed the bottle and brought it to her. At first, she would not take it. She turned her head away. Then she mouthed the nipple once and let it slip. Walter did not force it. He wet his fingers, touched them to her mouth, waited, tried again. The first swallow came after 7 minutes. The second after 9. Then nothing for a while. By dark, she had taken 12 ounces from a bottle that should have held 32. The men at the auction would have called that proof. Cal Morgan would have said, some calves were born finished. Walter wrote the number down anyway. 12 ounces. Not enough. Not nothing. The wind picked up after sunset. It moved against the barn siding, with a low wooden groan. Walter brought the navy calf blanket from the feed store and fastened it gently around her thin body. She flinched once at the strap, then stood still. He checked her temperature, wrote it down, checked the water, wrote that down too. At 9:30, he tried the bottle again. She sucked twice. Stopped. At 10:15, she lowered herself into the straw. Not gracefully, but without falling. Walter stood beside the stall gate, with the bottle still in his hand. The men at the auction would have called that proof too. Walter watched the calf side rise and fall, under the blanket. Then he opened the notebook one more time, and wrote, Day 1, took 12 ounces of 32. Still shaking. Resting. Watch through night. He clicked the pen shut. The barn was quiet, except for the wind, the old boards, and the small, uneven breathing of a calf nobody wanted. Walter pulled a wooden chair beside the stall gate. And just before midnight, when the bottle was warm for the third time, Lot 19B lifted her head. Just before midnight, Lot 19B lifted her head. Walter did not move fast. A weak calf could be startled backward by kindness if a man came at her too quickly. He had learned that years ago, and Ruth had known it before he did. So he stayed in the wooden chair beside the stall gate, the bottle resting in a bucket of warm water at his feet, and let the calf decide whether she meant it. She blinked once. Then she lifted her head another inch. The navy calf blanket rose and fell over her ribs. Walter stood slowly, picked up the bottle, and stepped into the stall with the careful quiet of a man entering a church after the service had already begun. "Easy," he said. He touched the nipple to her mouth. She turned away. He waited. The barn boards creaked in the wind. Somewhere outside, a loose piece of tin tapped twice and stopped. The old yellow bulb above the stall hummed faintly. Walter could see his own breath. When he exhaled, he tried again. This time, the calf mouthed the nipple. Then she pulled once. Not much. A weak pull. Uncertain, like she was not convinced. The effort would be worth what it cost her. Walter kept the bottle steady. She pulled again. By 12:30, she had taken 4 more ounces. Walter wrote it down. Day 1, 12:32 a.m. Took 4 more ounces. 16 total. Still weak. Still interested. He looked at that last sentence. For a moment. Still interested. That was not a veterinary measurement. It was not something a man could put on a sale sheet. But Walter had lived long enough around animals to know that interest mattered. A creature that still noticed warmth, still turned toward water, still tried to swallow. When swallowing was hard, had not given up its side of the bargain. So Walter did not give up his. He slept in the chair for 40 minutes at a time. At 2, he checked the blanket. At 3, he checked the water. At 4, he put one hand against her neck. Warm. Not fever hot. Not cold. Warm enough. At 5:30, before the first gray of morning reached the east cracks in the barn wall, he warmed the bottle again. She took 6 ounces. By sunrise, Walter had a page full of small numbers. 16 ounces by midnight. 6 more before dawn. Temperature normal. Stool loose but not watery. Leg shaking unchanged. Eyes brighter when touched. He underlined the last line once. Eyes brighter. That morning, while most of Graves County was deciding whether Cal Morgan had been right, Walter was in the south barn with a thermometer, a bottle, and a black composition notebook. He did not call anyone to say the calf had lived through the night. He did not drive to the diner. He did not go to Ramsey Feed and explain himself. He cleaned the stall. He stripped the wet straw from the corner where she had lain and carried it out in a forkful that steamed faintly in the cold. He spread fresh bedding under her, not too deep, then pressed it down with his boots so her hooves could find footing. He rinsed the bottle in water, hot enough to redden his hands. He mixed the next feeding by the directions, and checked it against the inside of his wrist. Ruth would have done the same. At 9, Lot 19B stood. Not for long. 23 seconds, by Walter S. count. Her front knees shook the whole time, but she pushed herself up, stood with her head low, and took 3 unsteady steps toward the water bucket. Walter did not cheer. He marked the time. Day 2. Stood 23 seconds. Reached water. Took 2 swallows. Progress did not need applause. It needed proof. The next several days became a routine, so exact that Walter could feel the hours, by the work they required. 6 in the morning. Bottle. Temperature. Water check. 8:30. Fresh straw. Rub the legs. Open the upper barn door, if the air was dry. Noon. Bottle again. Small handful of calf starter in the shallow pan. Note interest. 3. Water. Stall check. Blanket adjustment. 6. Bottle. Temperature. Listen for breathing. 10. Last check. Barn light. Quiet talk. Whether she answered or not. He did not talk much. Mostly simple things. Easy. Try again. That S enough for now. Stand if you can. The calf did not understand the words, but she began to understand. The man who brought them. On day 3, she finished 24 ounces from a 32-ounce bottle. On day 4, she stood 1 minute and 12 seconds without leaning against the wall. On day 5, she took 3 mouthfuls from the shallow pan and sneezed calf starter onto Walter's sleeve. Walter looked at the feed on his jacket. Then he looked at her. "Well," he said, "that's one way to do it." It was the first time. He almost smiled in the barn. On day 6, he used the weight tape. The tape was old, yellowed at the edges, and stiff from years in a drawer, but the numbers still read clear enough. He wrapped it behind her front legs, snug but not tight, and waited until she stopped shifting. She did not like the tape. Walter wrote the number down. He did not decide what it meant yet. One number was only a number. Friday would be the first real test. One good number could be luck. 2 good numbers could be direction. On day 7, he measured again. Up 2 pounds. Maybe feed. Maybe water. Maybe error in the tape. Walter knew better than to celebrate a measurement before it repeated itself. On day 10, it did. Up 4 pounds. From the first reading, he wrote, Day 10. Weight tape up 4 pounds. Drinking full bottle by evening. Shaking less after standing. Ears quicker. That Tuesday, Walter went back to Ramsey feed. He needed another sack of calf starter and a bag of straw. He also needed hinge bolts for the south stall door, which had started dragging low enough to scrape the floor every time he opened it. The bell over the feed store door rang. When he stepped inside, Gary Tuttle was there again, leaning near the coffee machine, with the same foam cup, and the same look of a man, waiting for a story to finish itself. Phil Ramsey stood behind the counter. Morning, Walter. Phil. Gary did not wait long. That calf still with us. Walter picked up the hinge bolts from the small hardware bin. She is. Gary raised his eyebrows. Standing? Some. Eating? More than she was. Gary looked toward Phil, as if the answer needed translating. Phil kept his face even. How much more? Walter set the bolts on the counter. Full bottle last night. 4 pounds up on the tape by day 10. That changed the air in the store. By a small amount. Not enough for anyone to admit anything. Enough for Gary to take a quieter sip of coffee. Phil rang up the bolts, the starter, and the straw. 4 pounds, he said. Walter nodded. Could be water. Could be. Phil said, could also be 4 pounds. Walter took the receipt. That's why I'll measure again Friday. Gary gave a short laugh, but it did not have the same shape as before. Outside, Walter loaded the truck himself. Phil came out with the straw and tossed it into the bed. You naming her yet? Walter looked toward the road, then back at the feed sacks. No. Phil nodded. Friday, maybe. Walter did not answer. But he thought about it. On the drive home, the calf was waiting at the stall gate. When he got back, that was new. Not standing in the corner. Not lying in the straw. Standing at the gate. Head low, but turned toward the sound of the truck. Walter stopped in the barn doorway. The feed sack hung from one hand. The calf flicked one ear. Then she stepped once toward him. It was not a strong step. It was not pretty. Her knees still trembled when her weight settled. But she had chosen to meet him. Walter stood there long enough for the feed sack to pull at his shoulder. Then he walked in and poured a little calf starter into the shallow pan. She lowered her head and ate. Slowly. Awkwardly. With effort. But she ate. By the end of the second week, the south barn smelled less like sickness and more like work. Warm straw. Sweet feed. Damp wood. Milk replacer. The sharp mineral smell of calf starter. When Walter opened the sack, the numbers improved. In small, stubborn increments. Day 12. Full bottle morning and evening. Day 13. Stood 3 minutes 40 seconds. Day 14. Weight tape up 6 pounds from first reading. Day 15. Walked from back wall to bucket without stopping. Day 16. Shaking worse after cold rain. Appetite held. Walter liked that last line. Appetite held. A thing that kept eating was still arguing for itself. On day 19, he opened the stall gate to clean the bedding and forgot to latch it behind him. He had the manure fork in both hands. When he heard straw shift, he turned. The calf had stepped into the aisle. For 1 second, Walter thought she might bolt, or fall, or tangle her legs under herself. Instead, she stood there, with the navy blanket crooked over one shoulder, looking at him as if the aisle had been her idea all along. Walter lowered the fork. Well, he said. She took another step. Then another. All the way to the barn door, where sunlight lay in a pale rectangle. across the floor. She stopped there. Her whole body trembled from the work of it. But she stood in the light. Walter did not touch her right away. He let her have the moment. Outside, the pasture was still brown from winter. The fence line needed mending. The creek lot was soft from last night's rain. Nothing about the farm had changed enough for a person passing on the road to notice. But in the south barn, Lot 19B had walked to the door on her own. Walter went to the shelf, where he kept the notebook. He opened to the next clean line. For a while, he held the pen without writing. Then he crossed out Lot 19B. Not hard. Just one clean line. Beside it, he wrote, Daisy. He looked at the name, then at the calf, standing in the sunlight. Day 19. Daisy walked to barn door on her own, stood steady and light, still shaking, still here. He closed the notebook. For the first time since the auction, Walter let himself rest one hand on her neck, without measuring anything. Daisy, he said. Her ear flicked toward his voice. It was a small answer, but it was an answer. The next morning, Walter came to the barn before sunrise, with the bottle warm under his coat. Daisy was not at the gate. The calf starter in the shallow pan had not been touched. The water bucket was still full. Daisy was lying in the straw, head low, eyes open. Walter stopped. The bottle steamed in the cold air. Daisy, he said. Her ear moved once, but she did not get up. Walter stood in the stall doorway, with the warm bottle under his coat. Daisy lay in the straw, with her head low, eyes open, one ear moving just enough to tell him she had heard her name. The calf starter in the shallow pan had not been touched. The water bucket was still full. That was not a good morning. Walter set the bottle in the warm water pail and stepped into the stall slowly. Daisy did not try to rise. Her breathing was steady, but slower than usual. When he put his hand against her neck, she felt too warm under the navy blanket. Not burning. Not right either. He took the thermometer from the shelf, shook it down, and waited beside her in the straw, while the barn came awake around them. A wren moved in the rafters. The east cracks in the wall turned pale. Outside, one of the barn cats scratched under the hay pallet for mice. The thermometer read a little over 103. Walter looked at it once. Then he wrote it down. Day 20. Temp high. No feed touched. Water full. Lying down. Ear response present. Ear response present. It was the kind of note a man wrote when he needed one small thing to hold on to. He called Dr. Lyle at 7:15. The vet came before noon, in a white pickup with rust above the wheel wells, and a thermometer clipped to the pocket of his coveralls. He had been treating livestock in Graves County for 30 years, which meant he knew how to be honest, without being dramatic. He listened to Daisy's chest, checked her eyes, pressed along her ribs, looked at the water bucket and the untouched pan. She's had a hard start, Dr. Lyle said. Walter nodded. She turning bad. Not if she keeps swallowing. That was not comfort exactly. But it was a door left open. Dr. Lyle gave Walter instructions. Keep the stall dry. Push small amounts. Often. Do not flood her. Do not let her chill. Call if the breathing changes. Call if she stops responding. Walter wrote every word down. When Dr. Lyle left, Walter cleaned the stall again, even though it did not need cleaning badly. He changed the straw, because dry straw was one thing he could control. He warmed the bottle again, and offered it 2 ounces at a time. Daisy took one, then turned away. At noon, she took 2 more. At 3, nothing. At 6, 3 ounces. Walter did not leave the barn, except to make coffee, rinse bottles, and bring in another armload of straw. By dark, the notebook had more numbers than progress. But progress was there. Small. Mean. Stubborn. At 10:30, Daisy lifted her head, without being called. Walter held the bottle steady. She drank 5 ounces. He wrote, Day 20 night. Took 5 ounces on her own pull. Still down. Still fighting. The next morning, she stood. Only for 18 seconds. But she stood. By the 3rd morning, she ate 4 mouthfuls of calf starter and drank from the bucket. By day 24, her temperature had settled. By day 26, she walked the length of the stall aisle twice, slow and stiff, but under her own power. Walter measured her again Friday. Up 1 pound. Not the kind of number a man bragged about. The kind he respected. At Ramsey feed the next Tuesday, the story had changed shape again. Not enough to become praise. Enough to become curiosity. Gary Tuttle was at the coffee machine when Walter came in. Phil Ramsey was stacking seed catalogs on the counter. Mrs. Harlan was near the back, reading the label on a bag of layer pellets, like it contained a weather report. Gary looked up. Heard your calf took a turn. She did. Still with us. Walter picked up a new salt block and set it on the counter. She is. Phil glanced at him. Eating? Some. Standing? More. Gary took a sip of coffee. Slower than usual. Cal says that kind don't ever really come back. Says they just cost you slower. Walter looked at the salt block. Then at Gary. A bad day does erase a good month. Nobody laughed. That was the first change. Not agreement. Not respect. Just the absence of laughter. Where laughter used to be. Back home, Daisy began to outgrow the stall. Not all at once. Walter did not rush her. He opened the gate. For 20 minutes in the morning, and 20 minutes at dusk. At first, she only stood in the aisle. Then she walked to the barn door. Then she stepped outside onto the packed dirt, where the sun fell warm against the south wall. The first time she reached the fence line. Walter wrote it down. Day 32. Walked to south fence. Stood 7 minutes. Shaking visible after turn. Appetite strong. On day 36, he took the blanket off for the afternoon. On day 39, He left it off until sundown. On day 41, Daisy followed him halfway across the lot to the water trough, then stopped and looked back at the barn, as if surprised by how far she had come. On day 49, Walter measured her again. He wrapped the weight tape behind her front legs, waited until she settled, and pulled the tape snug. Then he checked the number twice. Day 49. Weight tape up 18 pounds from first reading. Coat smoother along the neck, shaking only after long turns. Appetite strong. Walter read the line back to himself. 18 pounds did not make Daisy a show calf, but it made her something no one at the auction had expected. Growing. The girl first appeared at the fence on a Saturday. She was maybe 11, with a blue 4-H sweatshirt too large in the sleeves, and a braid down her back. Her grandmother sat in an idling sedan by the road, with the window cracked. The girl stood with both hands on the top wire, watching Daisy eat. Walter was carrying a feed scoop. When he saw her, "You looking for somebody?" he asked. The girl stepped back quickly. "No, sir." Then, after a moment, she added, "My grandma said that was the calf from the auction." Walter looked at Daisy. She was. The girl looked again. "She does tea shake as much?" "No." "What's her name?" "Daisy." The girl seemed to like that. She said it quietly once, like testing whether the name fit. Daisy. Her name was Emily Carter. Her grandmother had known Ruth through church years before. Emily was in 4, but she had not shown an animal since the previous summer, when a steer pulled loose in the practice ring, and everyone laughed while she cried behind the wash rack. She did not tell Walter that part on the first day. Her grandmother did. Later. Softly. "She wants to try again," the old woman said from the car window. "But wanting and stepping into a ring are not the same thing." Walter looked toward the fence. Emily was standing very still, while Daisy stretched her nose toward the wire. "No," Walter said. "They not." The next week, Walter bought a plain rope halter from Ramsey Feed. Phil saw it on the counter. "For Daisy?" Walter nodded. Gary, near the coffee machine, looked over. "You fixing to show that calf?" Walter picked up the halter. "Fixing to teach her to walk beside somebody." "That somebody being you." Walter looked out the front window, toward the road. "Maybe not." The halter training was slow. The first day, Daisy backed away as soon as the rope touched her face. Walter took it off. The second day, she let it rest across her nose for 12 seconds. The third day, Emily held the lead rope, while Walter stood close enough to help, and far enough not to take the work from her. Daisy took 2 steps. Emily took 2 with her. Both of them looked ready to apologize for being nervous. Walter said, "That's enough for today." Emily blinked. "That's all?" "That's more than yesterday." By the second week, Daisy could walk half the barn aisle with Emily. By the third, they made it around the small lot. Daisy still shook after tight turns, and Emily still held the rope too close to her chest. But neither of them quit. By then, Two trucks had slowed on County Road 6. Nobody stopped. Nobody said anything. But they looked long enough for Walter to know the story was traveling again. This time, it was not traveling as a joke. Walter wrote, Day 58. Emily led Daisy one full circle. No pulling. Both scared. Both stayed. That same afternoon, the county fair flyer came in the mail. Walter almost set it aside. Then he saw the line near the bottom. Open youth handling. Care and condition recognition. The entry form was due by Friday at 5. Walter read the line twice. The entry fee was $12. He filled out the form at the kitchen table, with his notebook open beside him. Animal name: Daisy. Handler: Emily Carter. Owner: Walter Hayes. Class: Open youth handling / care and condition. Reason for entry: if special consideration requested. Walter sat with the pen over the blank line. Then he wrote, Calf purchased in light condition. Recovered through daily care. Youth handler trained with her. From groundwork. He did not write miracle. He did not write laughed at. He did not write what Cal Morgan had said about some calves being born finished. The form did not need that. The work was enough. 1 week before the fair, a hard rain came through Graves County. The barn roof seam started tapping again. Water found its way down the inside wall and darkened the straw near Daisy's stall. Thunder rolled over the pasture before daylight. And by morning, Daisy was off feed. Emily came after school and saw the full pan. Her face changed. She's not going to be ready, she said. Walter was lifting the wet straw out with a fork. She had a bad morning. What if she has one at the fair? Then we handle the bad morning. Emily looked at Daisy, then at the muddy lot beyond the barn door. What if people laugh? Walter stopped working. He leaned on the fork handle. People laughing doesn't mean they rewrite. Emily swallowed. Daisy reached down and took one slow mouthful from the pan. Walter nodded toward her. There, he said. She answered first. By fair day morning, the rain had passed. The air smelled washed clean, and the gravel drive steamed lightly, where the sun hit it. Walter brushed Daisy until the dull brown coat laid smooth over her ribs. Emily wiped the show halter with a rag. Daisy stood quiet, thinner than show calves, not as square, not as polished, but alive in a way that made comparison feel like the wrong kind of measuring. She stepped into the trailer on the second try. At the fairground gate, trucks were already lined up. Children in 4-H shirts carried buckets. A loudspeaker cracked somewhere near the livestock barn. The air smelled of sawdust, hay, diesel, and funnel cakes not yet hot enough to sell. Cal Morgan stood near the entrance, with a paper coffee cup in his hand. He looked at Daisy, then at Walter. His eyes narrowed. That the same shaking calf? Walter rested one hand on the trailer door. Same calf. Cal looked again. And for the first time since the auction, he did not laugh right away. For once, Cal Morgan did not have another sentence ready. Walter opened the trailer door. Emily Carter stood beside him, in her blue 4-H sweatshirt, both hands holding the lead rope. A little too tight. Her braid lay flat down her back, and her boots were clean, in the way boots are clean, only before a fair begins. Walter saw her looking at the ring. "You remember what we said?" he asked. Emily swallowed. "Walk slow. Keep deep breathing. Don't to look at the people too much. And if Daisy stops..." "I stopped with her." Walter nodded. "That's right." Daisy stepped down from the trailer. On the second try, her hooves touched the packed dirt. Then the gravel. Then the sawdust, near the livestock barn entrance. Around them, the fair was waking up in layers. Children in white shirts carried feed pans. Men backed trailers, with one arm over the seat. A loudspeaker cracked and called for open class entries. The air smelled of hay, diesel, damp straw, and funnel cakes, just beginning to heat. A few people turned, when Walter and Emily led Daisy toward the wash rack. At first, they only looked, because people at fairs look at everything. Then recognition moved through them. That Walter Hayes. That the calf from the auction? The shaking one. Nobody said it loudly. They did not have to. Emily heard enough. Her shoulders tightened. Daisy felt it through the rope and stopped. Walter stepped closer, but he did not take the lead from Emily. "Let her look," he said quietly. Emily stood still. Daisy turned one ear toward the loudspeaker, then toward the row of calves, tied along the barn rail. A big black steer stopped at a fly. A metal bucket hit concrete. Somewhere behind them. Daisy trembled once, through her front legs. Then she took another step. Emily took one with her. They reached their assigned space, between two clean red heifers, and a young steer, with a coat so glossy, it looked almost oiled. Daisy looked smaller there, rougher, more ordinary. But she stood. Walter tied her low, checked the knot, and wrote the number from the show card into his notebook. Entry 42. Daisy. Open youth handling / care and condition. Handler Emily Carter stood quiet at tie rail. At 10:15, the class was called. Emily's grandmother stood near the rail, with both hands around her purse strap. Phil Ramsey had come from the feed store, still wearing his work shirt, with a seed company cap in one hand. Mrs. Harlan stood beside him. Gary Tuttle leaned against a post, coffee in hand, but not talking much. Carl Morgan stood farther back, not hiding, not stepping forward either. The ring was smaller than Emily had imagined, and larger than she wanted. Sawdust covered the ground, in a thin layer. Folding chairs lined one side. Children in 4-H shirts waited with animals. That looked better bred, better fed, and better prepared for photographs. Emily led Daisy to the gate. Walter stood outside the rail. "She knows you," he said. Emily nodded once. The gate opened. For the first 10 steps, everything went right. Daisy walked beside Emily, slow but even. Her head stayed low. The lead rope hung, with just enough slack. Emily remembered not to pull. The judge watched from the center of the ring, with a clipboard tucked under one arm. Then the loudspeaker cracked. Daisy stopped. Her whole body tightened. A few people in the chairs leaned forward. Emily looked back at Walter. Walter did not move. He only lifted his hand. Palm down. Easy. Emily turned back to Daisy. She did not tug the rope. She did not apologize. She waited. Daisy's ear flicked. Then the calf took one step. The people in the folding chairs went still. Another step. Then another. By the time Emily and Daisy reached the far side of the ring, the whispering had changed. It was no longer the sound people made when they expected failure. It was the sound they made when they had begun adjusting what they thought they knew. The judge walked over after the first pass. He was a broad man, with a gray mustache, worn boots, and the calm expression of someone who had seen enough animals to know the difference between polish and care. He looked at Daisy's legs, her eyes, her coat. Then he looked at Emily. How long have you been working with her? Emily's voice was small, but clear. Almost 6 weeks, sir. And how was she when you started? Emily glanced at Walter. Walter gave no answer for her. Emily looked back at the judge. She was scared and weak. She shook when she turned. But Mr. Hayes said, "A bad day does erase a good month." The judge wrote something on his clipboard. A few people near the rail turned toward Walter. Walter looked down at the sawdust. The class continued. Daisy was not the biggest. She was not the straightest. She was not the calf a buyer would have picked first from a pen. But when Emily stopped, Daisy stopped. When Emily walked, Daisy followed. When another calf bawled and bumped hard against its handler, Daisy flinched, then held. That was the moment Phil Ramsey took off his cap. Not because the class was over, because he understood what he was seeing. The judge called the handlers forward. There were regular placements first. A polished red heifer took first. A black steer with a strong frame took second. A clean little Hereford took third. Emily clapped for them, with one hand still holding Daisy's rope. Then the judge picked up a small white ribbon from the table. We also have a care and condition recognition today, he said into the microphone. This is not about the animal that came in looking perfect. This is about the work done after everyone else might have stopped looking. The ring went quiet. The judge looked toward Daisy. You can see care in an animal, he said. It shows in the coat, in the feet, and in the way she trusts. The hand on the lead. This calf did not come here perfect. She came here as proof that somebody stayed. Walter's fingers tightened around the rail. The judge looked toward Emily. Entry 42. Daisy, handled by Emily Carter, owned by Walter Hayes. For a second, Emily did not move. Then the ring steward walked over and placed the ribbon in her hand. The applause did not come like thunder. It came like rain, starting on a tin roof. First from Emily Ann's grandmother, then Phil, then Mrs. Harlan, then the people who had heard the story, then the people who only understood it by looking. Gary Tuttle looked down at his coffee cup, like it had suddenly become something he did not know what to do with. Emily pressed the ribbon against Daisy's neck and started crying before she could stop herself. Daisy turned her head and bumped the girl's sleeve with her nose. Walter looked away. Not fast enough to hide it completely. After the class, people came by the stall. A woman asked how old Daisy was. A man asked what Walter had fed her. A boy reached out carefully and asked if he could touch her forehead. Emily answered some of the questions. Walter answered the ones that needed numbers. 32-ounce bottle. Weight tape every Friday. 18 pounds up by day 49. Slow turns. Short sessions. Dry straw. No miracle. Just work. Near noon, Cal Morgan walked over. He had no coffee now. No paper cup to hold. No easy way to look busy. He stopped outside Daisy's space and looked at the white ribbon tied near the stall card. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he took off his cap. I said she would live long enough to eat breakfast, Cal said. Then I said, some calves are born finished. Walter waited. Cal looked at Daisy, then at Emily, who was brushing sawdust from Daisy's shoulder, with more pride than skill. I was wrong both times. The words were not loud. They did not need to be. Walter nodded once. She just needed time. Cal looked back at him. And somebody stubborn enough to give it. Walter almost smiled. That too. By late afternoon, the fairground had grown hot and dusty. Daisy loaded into the trailer, tired but steady. Emily's grandmother hugged her near the gate. Phil Ramsey waved from beside his truck. Gary Tuttle stood with both hands in his pockets and said, "She looks better than I thought she would." Walter said, "She does." That was all. On the drive home, Daisy shifted once in the trailer, then settled. The ribbon lay on the passenger seat, beside Walter's notebook, white against the cracked vinyl. Back at the farm, he hung it on a nail, beside the south barn door. Not in the house, not where visitors would see it first. Beside the door Daisy had walked to, on day 19, when standing in the light had been its own kind of victory. Emily had left a folded note under the windshield wiper of his truck. Walter opened it after evening chores. "Thank you for letting me walk Daisy. I was scared, but she was too. We did it anyway." Walter read it twice. Then he opened the notebook. County Fair Day. Daisy stood steady. Emily stayed with her. Town finally looked closer. He paused, then added one more line. Weak does not always mean worthless. Sometimes it only means nobody has stood beside it long enough. Outside, Daisy lowered her head to the feed pan and ate slowly in the last gold light of the day. Walter stood in the barn doorway and listened. No laughter. Just the sound of a calf eating, a girl's ribbon moving softly in the evening air, and a small farm remembering that worth is not always loud when it first arrives. If this story reminded you of someone who kept trying when others gave up, share it with them. And tell us in the comments, have you ever believed in something nobody else wanted?